Under the pale glow of a crescent moon, a faded, winding road stretched through a dense forest, shrouded in heavy mist. Locals called it Whisper Hollow, a place so steeped in mystery and dread that even the most skeptical avoided it after dark. They spoke of unnatural occurrences, of shadows with no owners, and disembodied whispers that grew louder the deeper one ventured. Few dared to traverse the hollow, but Sarah, a seasoned urban explorer, was no stranger to thrill-seeking. She'd heard the stories: missing hikers, strange lights, and the occasional mention of people returning with no memory of the journey. Yet, armed with her camera and a naive confidence, Sarah was determined to capture the truth behind the tales. As she stepped out of her car, the forest greeted her with an unsettling silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. The air was colder than she expected, biting at her skin. Sarah switched on her flashlight and began recording. Her voice, steady but tinged with nerves, narrated her first impressions. The mist seemed alive, swirling unnaturally, as if it were trying to conceal something. A mile in, the first anomaly occurred. Her flashlight dimmed and flickered, though its batteries were fresh. "Typical," she muttered, smacking it in frustration. But it wasn't just her light. The forest had darkened, the silvery moonlight swallowed by an unseen force. Then came the sound, a faint hum, rhythmic and mechanical, utterly out of place in the natural setting. It seemed to emanate from all around her, vibrating through the air and into her chest. Sarah froze, her heart hammering. She whispered into the camera, "This has to be electrical interference or something explainable." The words rang hollow even to her. The hum grew louder, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible murmur. Straining her ears, Sarah realized it wasn't just noise. It was voices. Dozens of them, whispering in a language she couldn't comprehend. Panicked, she swung her flashlight wildly. Its weak beam caught the outline of something moving in the mist. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of pale light. When the beam passed over it, the creature didn't flinch or retreat. It simply stared, unblinking. The whispers intensified, now interspersed with faint sobs and gasps for breath. Sarah backed away, the camera shaking in her hands. "I'm leaving," she shouted, her voice cracking. The thing in the mist tilted its head, almost curiously, but made no move to follow. As Sarah turned to flee, her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling. The camera clattered away, its lens capturing a distorted glimpse of the creature advancing toward her. When she scrambled to her feet, the forest had changed. The road she'd walked in on was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gnarled trees. The hum had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against her ears. Sarah spun in circles, disoriented. She tried her phone. It wouldn't turn on. Her watch read 3:17 a.m., though she was certain it couldn't have been more than an hour since her arrival. Her breathing quickened as she picked a direction and started running. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at her clothes and skin. The whispers returned, this time louder, clearer. They weren't speaking an alien language anymore. They were calling her name. "Sarah! Sarah! Come closer." She stumbled into a clearing, gasping for air. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging and windows shattered. The door hung ajar, swaying slightly as if beckoning her. Desperation overruled caution. She darted inside and slammed the door behind her. The interior was worse than she expected. Moldy furniture, walls covered in deep scratches, and a foul stench that made her stomach churn. She pressed her back against the door, her eyes darting around the room. That's when she noticed the photographs. They were strewn across a decaying table, showing faces twisted in terror. One image stopped her breath. It was a picture of herself, taken just moments ago, her expression frozen in the exact moment she had tripped in the forest. The camera she dropped was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from above. Heavy and deliberate, they creaked across the rotting wood. Sarah held her breath, her fingers fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. A rusty knife lay half buried in the grime on the floor. She grabbed it, clutching it tightly as the footsteps descended the staircase. The door to the cabin burst open, and she ran blindly into the forest, the whispers now a cacophony that seemed to come from the very ground. Her legs burned, and her lungs felt like they would collapse, but she didn't stop. When she finally saw the faint outline of her car, relief flooded her. She dove inside, locking the doors and fumbling to start the engine. It roared to life, and she sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. Days later, Sarah reviewed the footage she had managed to recover. Most of it was corrupted, static-laden, and distorted, but one fragment stood out. It showed her tripping over the root, the camera catching the creature as it loomed over her. But the final frame made her blood run cold. The lens had panned, and standing just behind her, a hand resting on her shoulder, was a figure she hadn't seen that night. Her own doppelganger, staring directly into the camera with a wide, unnatural grin. Beneath the flickering neon sign of a roadside diner, Jacob parked his car, the engine sputtering as it died. It was late, the kind of late where the world seemed frozen in time. He'd been driving for hours on an unfamiliar route, his GPS losing signal somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The diner, though oddly out of place, was a welcome sight. Its name, Last Stop Cafe, glowed weakly in the darkness. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of burnt coffee and something metallic. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned, wiping a glass with deliberate slowness. There were no other patrons, just the faint hum of an old jukebox in the corner playing a hauntingly familiar tune. "Late night, huh?" Jacob tried to make small talk as he slid into a booth. The waitress didn't respond, her movements mechanical. Shrugging, he scanned the laminated menu, its edges frayed and sticky. The words seemed strange. Soul stew, midnight roast, and traveler's special. But exhaustion dulled his curiosity. He ordered a coffee and a sandwich, the simplest thing he could think of. As he waited, the air in the diner grew heavier. The jukebox crackled and the melody warped, distorting into something sinister. Jacob glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands spinning erratically. His unease deepened. He looked out the window, expecting to see the empty highway, but instead there was nothing. No road, no sky, just an infinite void of pitch-black darkness. "Here you go," the waitress finally said, setting his plate down with a clatter. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and lifeless. She stared at him a beat too long, her lips curling into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The coffee was cold, the sandwich dry and tasteless. But Jacob was too unnerved to complain. "You've been here before?" The waitress said suddenly, her voice low and hollow. It wasn't a question. Jacob frowned. "No, I haven't. I'm just passing through." She tilted her head, her smile widening unnaturally. "Passing through, that's what they all say." Before he could respond, the door to the diner slammed open. A man stumbled in, his clothes torn and face streaked with blood. "Don't eat!" the man screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Jacob. "Don't touch anything here! It's a trap!" The waitress sighed, rolling her eyes. "He's just upset. He didn't follow the rules," she said casually, as if discussing a minor inconvenience. The man lunged at Jacob, grabbing his arm. His touch was icy, his grip desperate. "You have to leave now," he hissed, "before they take you too." Jacob pulled away, his heart racing. The man's eyes were wild, his words disjointed, but something about his panic struck a chord. "What are you talking about?" Jacob demanded. "They feed on you," the man whispered. "Every bite you take, every second you stay, they're draining you. Look around. This isn't a diner. It's a graveyard." Jacob glanced down at his hands. His skin seemed paler than before, his fingers trembling. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment the cheerful diner facade faded, revealing cracked walls, skeletal remains slumped in booths, and shadowy figures lurking in the corners. The waitress slammed a hand on the counter, drawing Jacob's attention. Her form shimmered, her face melting into something grotesque, a skeletal grin with hollow black eyes that burned like embers. "You should have finished your meal," she snarled. "It went quicker." The man grabbed Jacob again, dragging him toward the door. "Run!" he yelled. Jacob didn't hesitate, bolting outside, where the void greeted him like a living thing. The man shoved him forward, and Jacob stumbled, falling into what felt like freezing water. When he opened his eyes, he was lying in his car, parked in a ditch. The diner was gone, replaced by a dark stretch of highway. His chest heaved as he sat up, the smell of burnt coffee clinging to his clothes. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, and the screen lit up with a single message. "See you again soon. Last Stop Cafe." He threw the phone aside and sped off, vowing never to return. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly escaped. His reflection in the rearview mirror was wrong, its lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. In the heart of a small, forgotten town stood an abandoned factory, its towering smokestacks silhouetted against a perpetually gray sky. The locals avoided it like a plague, sharing hushed stories about the workers who had vanished without a trace decades ago. They called it the Echo Mill. For those who dared step inside, claimed to hear the voices of the lost, crying out in agony. For Tyler and his friends, the mill was a perfect Halloween challenge. Armed with flashlights, a couple of beers, and a thirst for adventure, the group decided to explore the site despite the town's warnings. "It's just an old building," Tyler reassured them. "Ghost stories to keep kids away. We'll be fine." They arrived at dusk. The mill loomed like a giant, its broken windows gaping like empty eyes. The rusted gate groaned as they pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still air. Inside, the factory floor was a labyrinth of corroded machinery, collapsed beams, and scattered debris. The air was thick, damp, and carried an unplaceable metallic tang. Their laughter faded as the darkness seemed to swallow their flashlights' beams. Every footstep echoed endlessly, as if something deep within the mill was imitating them. "Creepy," muttered Jamie, Tyler's girlfriend, clutching his arm. "Let's not stay too long." As they ventured further, they came across a staircase spiraling down into the earth. The steps were slick with moisture, and a cold draft wafted upward, carrying with it faint whispers. "You guys hear that?" asked Liam, the skeptic of the group. Everyone nodded, their expressions uneasy. "Probably just the wind," Tyler said, though his voice lacked conviction. They descended into what appeared to be an old boiler room. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words that sent chills down their spines. On the wall, someone had scrawled in soot, "Don't turn around." "Okay, I'm done," Jamie said, backing toward the stairs. But before she could take another step, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was suffocating, as if the mill itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound of a single metallic clang, like a hammer striking steel, echoing endlessly. The lights on their flashlights flickered, and for a moment, they all saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was unnaturally tall, its limbs too long, its face hidden beneath a veil of shadows. It didn't move but seemed to be watching them, waiting. "Run," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling. As they turned to flee, the figure moved. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, scraping against the walls as it gave chase. The group sprinted up the stairs, their screams mingling with the creature's guttural, inhuman growls. When they reached the factory floor, they found the machinery was no longer still. The rusted gears creaked and groaned, grinding together as if the factory was coming to life. Shapes darted between the shadows, dozens of them, all resembling the figure they had seen below. "Out the way we came," Tyler shouted, grabbing Jamie's hand. They barreled toward the entrance, but the gate was no longer open. Instead, it was sealed shut, the rusted bars warped into jagged spikes. Liam banged on the gate desperately. "It wasn't like this before," he yelled, tears streaming down his face. Behind them, the whispers returned, now louder and overlapping, forming an unbearable cacophony. The shapes in the shadows grew clearer. They weren't creatures, they were people. Faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving in silent screams. These were the workers, the lost souls of the Echo Mill. One of the shapes lunged forward, its skeletal fingers wrapping around Liam's wrist. He screamed as it dragged him into the darkness, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The others didn't wait. They scrambled over the gate, cutting their hands on the spikes, but too terrified to feel the pain. When they reached the safety of the road, Tyler turned back. The mill was dark and silent once more, as if it had swallowed their friend whole and returned to sleep. The group never spoke of what happened that night. Weeks later, Tyler received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a photograph of the four of them standing at the mill's entrance, taken from the perspective of someone inside the factory. At the bottom of the photo, written in smeared soot, were the words, "One down. Who's next?" The wind howled as Emily trudged through the snow-covered forest, her boots crunching against the icy ground. She'd gotten lost hours ago after taking a wrong turn on a hiking trail. Her phone had no signal, and the sun had long since disappeared, leaving her to rely on the pale light of a crescent moon. Every step felt heavier, the cold biting through her layers. The towering trees seemed to lean closer, their gnarled branches stretching toward her like skeletal fingers. She cursed herself for venturing out alone, but tried to focus on finding shelter. That's when she saw it. A cabin in the distance, its faint orange glow spilling out of the windows. Relief surged through her. She picked up her pace, slipping and stumbling as she hurried toward the promise of warmth and safety. The cabin was small and weathered, its wooden walls blackened by time. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the scent of burning wood greeted her as she knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. The thought of staying outside in the freezing cold was unbearable, so she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a crackling fire in the hearth. A single rocking chair sat in front of it, creaking slightly as if it had just been vacated. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with something. She didn't want to look too closely. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I got lost. Is anyone here?" Silence. Feeling uneasy but desperate, she closed the door behind her and moved closer to the fire. The warmth was immediate, and she sighed with relief as she stretched her frozen fingers toward the flames. Then she noticed the smell. It wasn't just burning wood. There was something acrid beneath it, like charred meat. Her stomach churned. She glanced toward the pot hanging over the fire. Something dark bubbled inside, and she quickly looked away, convincing herself it was just stew. A noise behind her made her jump. A soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. She spun around, her heart racing. The room was empty, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the window. Hesitantly, she approached, wiping away the frost to peer outside. The forest was eerily still, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then her breath caught in her throat. Standing just at the tree line was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes, if it had any, were obscured by the shadow of a hood, but she could feel its gaze piercing through her. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of something scratching against the cabin's wooden walls. Emily backed away from the window, her pulse pounding in her ears. She grabbed the nearest object, a rusted fire poker, and clutched it tightly. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice breaking. The scratching stopped. Silence enveloped the cabin once more, so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. She didn't dare move, her eyes darting around the room. The door creaked open. She gasped, raising the fire poker as the door swung wide, revealing nothing. Just the empty forest, silent and still. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts as she stepped toward the door, half expecting the figure to lunge out of the shadows. Then she felt it, a presence behind her. Cold breath against her neck. Before she could scream, a voice whispered, low and guttural, "You shouldn't have come here." Emily spun around, but the cabin was empty. The fire had gone out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through her as she stumbled toward the door, tripping over something on the floor. Her flashlight beam illuminated the rocking chair, now occupied. A woman sat there, her skin pale and waxy, her head lolling to one side. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and her lips moved silently, forming words Emily couldn't hear. The woman's neck was bent at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken. Emily scrambled backward, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The room filled with the sound of whispers, dozens of voices overlapping, growing louder and more insistent. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching and twisting. She bolted out of the cabin, not daring to look back. The whispers followed her, echoing through the forest, mingling with the crunch of her frantic footsteps. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing in the snow, her breath visible in the freezing air. When she finally dared to look up, the forest was silent again. The cabin was gone, as if it had never been there. But on the ground beside her, half buried in the snow, was a single rusted fire poker. Emily staggered to her feet and ran, vowing never to speak of what she'd seen. But the whispers stayed with her, haunting her dreams, their words growing clearer each night. "You'll be back. They always come back." The small town of Black Hollow had a legend. It was whispered among children and feared by the elders, who spoke of it only when absolutely necessary. The story was about the midnight caller, a being said to roam the outskirts of town. It didn't knock or ring a doorbell. It simply called, and if you answered, you would vanish, never to be seen again. Ava had heard the tale many times growing up. Her grandmother, who was deeply superstitious, warned her never to pick up the phone after midnight if the caller came through. But Ava was a skeptic. someone who believed in logic and reason, not ghost stories passed down through generations. When she moved into her grandmother's old house after her passing, the warnings seemed silly, almost quaint. The house was quiet, nestled at the edge of the woods. Ava found it charming, even peaceful, despite its age. For the first few weeks, life was uneventful. The nights were calm, the silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Until one night at exactly 12:03 a.m., the phone rang. The shrill sound jarred Ava awake. Groggy and disoriented, she stumbled to the old rotary phone in the kitchen, its cream-colored receiver covered in a layer of dust. The caller ID was blank, but that didn't strike her as odd. It was an ancient landline, after all. "Hello?" She mumbled into the receiver, her voice thick with sleep. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, a voice emerged, low and raspy. "Ava?" it whispered, stretching her name in a way that made her skin crawl. Her stomach dropped. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. The static crackled louder, drowning out whatever the caller said next. Ava slammed the phone down, her heart racing. She told herself it was a prank, maybe kids messing with her. She went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next night, at exactly 12:03 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, she didn't answer. She sat in the dark, staring at the phone as it rang and rang, the sound cutting through the stillness of the house. When it finally stopped, the silence was even more oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The calls continued, night after night. Sometimes it was just static. Other times, the voice whispered things she couldn't make out, though her name was always clear. She unplugged the phone, but at 12:03 a.m., it rang anyway, the receiver vibrating as if mocking her attempts to stop it. Ava started noticing other strange things. The shadows in the house seemed darker, more pronounced. She'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway when no one else was home. Objects moved from where she'd left them, a glass on the counter, a book on the shelf. One night, after the call ended, she heard something new, a faint tapping on the window. Her blood ran cold as she turned toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping persisted, slow and deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was outside wanted her to know it was there. Summoning her courage, she crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. The yard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight, but the glass was fogged with condensation, and written in the fog in long, jagged letters was one word: answer. Terrified, Ava decided to leave the house. She packed a bag, grabbed her keys, and bolted for the car. As she sped down the empty road, her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. She glanced at the screen, expecting a text or a voicemail notification, but instead, her phone displayed a call. Unknown number, 12:03 a.m. Ava nearly swerved off the road. Her heart pounded as the phone buzzed insistently. Against her better judgment, she picked it up and answered. Static. Then the voice, louder than ever, hissed. "You can't run from me, Ava. Come back." Panicked, she threw the phone onto the floor and pressed harder on the gas. The road stretched endlessly ahead of her, the forest on either side thick and oppressive. Her headlights caught movement, a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car screeched to a halt, the impact jarring her as she hit the figure. Shaking, she stepped out of the car, her legs weak beneath her. The road was empty. There was no body, no sign of an accident, just her idling car and the faint echo of her ragged breaths. Her phone buzzed again. She looked down at the screen. "Look behind you." She didn't want to turn. She didn't want to see. But something compelled her, as though invisible hands were forcing her head to move. Standing inches away, its face pale and featureless, was the figure. Its head tilted unnaturally as it raised a long, spindly hand toward her. The last thing Ava heard was the static-filled voice whispering in her ear, "I told you not to answer." By morning, her car was found abandoned on the side of the road, the driver's seat door hanging open. Ava was never seen again. But in the house she left behind, the phone still rings every night at 12:03 a.m., waiting for someone else to pick up. The town of Pinebrook had its share of strange stories, but none as chilling as the legend of the Mirror Man. It was said he only appeared to those who lived alone, manifesting in their mirrors late at night. The rules were simple. Never look too long and never, ever speak to him. Lila didn't believe in urban legends. She'd grown up in Pine Brook, heard all the tales, and dismissed them as small-town folklore. When she moved into her own apartment on the outskirts of town, the warnings from her neighbors didn't faze her. "Keep your mirrors covered at night," her elderly landlord had told her, handing over the keys. "He only comes if you look." She smiled politely but brushed off the advice. It was a mirror, just glass and silver. What harm could it do? The first few nights were uneventful. Her days were spent settling into her new home, unpacking boxes and getting used to the creaks and groans of the old building. At night, the mirrors stood uncovered, reflecting nothing but the dim glow of her bedside lamp. Until the fourth night. She was brushing her teeth, staring idly at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, when she noticed something odd. Her reflection wasn't moving in sync with her. It was subtle, a fraction of a second delay when she turned her head or lifted her hand. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass, and then her reflection smiled. Her toothbrush fell into the sink. She blinked, her heart racing. The image in the mirror had returned to normal, mirroring her wide, frightened eyes. "Just my imagination," she muttered, shaking her head. But she avoided looking at the mirror as she turned off the light and went to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, she was in her bedroom, sitting at her vanity. She had been fixing her hair when she caught the reflection out of the corner of her eye. A man stood behind her, a tall, shadowy figure with no discernible features. She whipped around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the man was gone. Fear clawed at her chest, but she tried to rationalize it. Stress, maybe. Too many late nights unpacking. Still, she draped a blanket over the vanity mirror before going to bed. The tapping started at 3 a.m., a soft, deliberate sound like fingernails on glass. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from the covered mirror. She stared at the draped surface, frozen. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint whispering, low, guttural, and impossible to understand. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped, and the silence was deafening. Then, in a voice that sounded like her own, the figure behind the blanket said, "Let me in." Lila didn't sleep that night. By morning, she was convinced she'd had a nightmare. She took the blanket off the mirror, daring it to show her something unnatural, but it reflected nothing more than her tired, pale face. Determined to prove she wasn't afraid, she left it uncovered. That night, she avoided looking at the mirror altogether. She read a book, watched TV, anything to distract herself. But as the clock struck 3 a.m., she heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder, clearer. "I'm waiting." Against her better judgment, she turned to the mirror. The man was there again, closer this time, his head tilted as if studying her, and though his face was still featureless, she felt his gaze burning into her. Her breath quickened, her legs trembling as she stood. "What do you want?" she stammered. The figure didn't move, but in the mirror her own reflection began to change. Her eyes darkened, her mouth twisted into a sinister grin she couldn't control. "Don't talk to him," her reflection hissed, its voice distorted and otherworldly. "He'll take your place." The lights flickered, and the room seemed to grow colder. Lila grabbed a nearby scarf and threw it over the mirror, cutting off the sight. The whispering stopped instantly, leaving the room in eerie silence. The next day, she called a friend to stay with her, desperate for company. But as the hours passed, she couldn't bring herself to mention the mirror man. She felt foolish, afraid of being mocked. Her friend left after dinner, promising to check in the next day. Lila locked every door and window, covered every mirror, and double-checked each one before going to bed. At 3 a.m., she woke to the sound of shattering glass. Her heart plummeted as she realized it was coming from the bathroom. She grabbed her phone, its flashlight trembling in her hand as she crept toward the sound. The bathroom mirror was cracked, shards glittering on the sink. But in the largest remaining piece, she saw him. The mirror man stepped forward, his shadowy form emerging from the broken glass, his featureless face twisted, forming a mouth that spread into a grotesque, toothless grin. "You look too long," he said, his voice like grinding metal. Lila screamed, but no one heard her. By morning, her apartment was empty, the mirrors all intact, reflecting a perfectly normal room. She was gone, but the mirrors remained. And if someone looked into them long enough, they might see a shadow flicker, a faint whisper calling them closer. The mirror man always needed someone new. The rain poured relentlessly that night, a steady drumming against the roof of the old farmhouse where Jack was staying. He had inherited the property from an uncle he barely knew, and though it was in the middle of nowhere, he decided to spend a weekend there to figure out what to do with it. The house was ancient, with creaking floors and walls that seemed to hold secrets in every crack. Jack was just beginning to doze off when he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on the second floor. His eyes snapped open, his pulse quickening. He was alone in the house, or at least he was supposed to be. Sitting up in bed, he strained to listen. The footsteps were deliberate, moving slowly across the floor above him. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment, he considered calling the police, but the spotty service out here made it pointless. Instead, he grabbed the heavy flashlight from his bedside table, gripping it tightly as he stepped into the hallway. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the house itself was watching him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, save for the rain pounding against the windows. Jack took a shaky breath and forced himself to move toward the stairs. The wood groaned under his weight as he climbed, his flashlight sweeping the landing at the top. Nothing. The upstairs hallway was empty, lined with old furniture draped in dusty sheets. A faint draft brushed past him, sending a shiver down his spine. He checked each room, finding nothing but cobwebs and shadows. "Probably just the house settling," he muttered to himself, though the explanation felt thin. As he turned to head back downstairs, he heard it again, this time behind him. A faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. He spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam landed on the last door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, though he could have sworn it had been closed earlier. "Hello?" he called again, his voice cracking. No response. He approached the door slowly, by each step feeling like it carried him closer to something he didn't want to face. When he reached it, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. Gathering his courage, he pushed the door open. The room was empty. Just an old, bare bed frame and a wardrobe leaning crookedly in the corner. But the air in the room felt wrong, thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on him. The flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then he saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the wardrobe, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shift in the darkness itself. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. The shadows stretched and twisted, forming into a shape that didn't belong. A figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its face obscured by a tangled mess of hair. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if studying him. Jack stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering wildly. "Stay back!" he shouted. Though his voice was barely more than a whisper, the figure didn't move. Instead, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed toward him. Its head tilted further, and though he couldn't see its face, Jack felt its gaze burning into him. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, the force of it shaking the walls. Jack turned, fumbling with the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and the sound of the rain outside was drowned out by a low, guttural growl. When he turned back, the figure was gone. The room was silent now, but the oppressive feeling remained. Jack pounded on the door, shouting for help, though he knew no one was around to hear him. Finally, the knob turned, and the door swung open. The hallway was empty. Jack didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat in the living room with every light in the house on, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. Morning eventually came, bringing with it a faint sense of relief. But as he packed his things, eager to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the wall in the upstairs hallway, scratched deep into the plaster, were 3 words: "See you soon." Jack left that day and never returned to the farmhouse. But the house wasn't done with him. Weeks later, back in his apartment, he woke to the sound of footsteps above him. Slow, deliberate, and impossible. He lived on the top floor. When he looked in the corner of his bedroom, the shadows began to move. The village of Ravenwood was known for its dense fog, which rolled in every night and cloaked the town in an eerie silence. But the fog wasn't the scariest thing about Ravenwood. The real fear lay in the stories of the Lantern Man, a figure said to wander the misty streets after midnight, carrying a flickering lantern and calling out for help. According to legend, if you saw his lantern and followed him, you'd disappear, your body never found. Those who stayed inside and ignored the cries would be safe. But there was one rule everyone knew. Never, ever answer his call. Anna had just moved to Ravenwood to escape the chaos of city life. The small cottage she rented sat on the outskirts of the village, near the edge of the forest where the fog was thickest. The locals had warned her about the Lantern Man, but she laughed it off. She wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. Her first few nights were peaceful. The fog was unsettling, sure, but the quiet was exactly what she needed. On the fourth night, she sat by the fireplace with a book, the soft crackle of the flames lulling her into a sense of comfort. Then she heard it. A voice, faint but clear, drifting through the fog outside her window. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, help me." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was past midnight, and the sound came from somewhere in the dense mist. She set her book down and walked to the window, peering out into the foggy darkness. She saw nothing at first, just the swirling gray haze. Then a faint light appeared. It was a small, flickering glow, like the flame of a lantern, moving slowly through the fog. The voice called out again, closer this time. "Please, I'm lost. I need help." Anna's logical mind kicked in. It had to be someone in trouble. Maybe a hiker who'd gotten disoriented in the woods. Grabbing her coat, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold, damp air clung to her skin as she called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" The light stopped moving, hovering in the fog. The voice responded, still distant but clear. "I'm over here. Please, come closer." She hesitated. Something about the voice didn't feel right. It was too smooth, too perfect, as if it were trying to sound human, but didn't quite understand how. She stepped back toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to go inside. The voice changed, its tone sharp and insistent. "Don't leave me. Come here." The lantern began moving again, faster this time, heading straight toward her. Panic surged through Anna. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice grew louder, now right outside her window. "Let me in. I'm lost. I need you." She backed away from the door, her hands trembling. The flickering light appeared outside the window, casting strange, twisting shadows on the walls of her cottage. The voice was no longer pleading. It was angry, a low growl beneath the words. "You can't hide from me, Anna." Her blood ran cold. How did it know her name? The light moved to the front door, the shadows dancing wildly across the room. The doorknob rattled, and the voice grew louder, more distorted. "Open the door, Anna. I just need a little help." She ran to her bedroom and locked the door, her heart pounding. The sound of the rattling doorknob stopped, replaced by silence, but then she heard it again, closer this time. The Lantern Man was inside the house. The faint light seeped under the door, flickering like a dying flame. The voice was soft now, almost a whisper. "Don't be afraid. I just want to see you." Anna pressed herself against the wall, tears streaming down her face. She closed her eyes, praying for the nightmare to end. The light grew brighter, and she felt the temperature drop, the air so cold it burned her skin. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the light disappeared. The house was silent. When Anna finally found the courage to open the door, she found no sign of anyone or anything in the house. But burned into the wood of her front door was a single haunting phrase, "I'll be back for you." Anna left Ravenwood the next morning, abandoning the cottage and vowing never to return. But sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in, she swears she sees a flickering lantern in the distance and hears a voice calling her name. The long, winding road to the old cabin was lined with towering trees that blocked out the moonlight. Rachel hadn't planned to drive out this late, but an unexpected delay meant she was navigating the unfamiliar terrain in the dead of night. Her GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath her tires. Her cousin had invited her to stay at the remote cabin for a weekend getaway, promising a peaceful escape from the city. Rachel wasn't thrilled about the isolation, but she needed a break, and the idea of a quiet retreat sounded perfect. The road stretched on endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Then she saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, barely illuminated by her headlights. At first, Rachel thought it was a person. A hitchhiker, maybe, but as she got closer, she realized something was wrong. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs were too long, its posture twisted and wrong. She slowed the car, her stomach knotting. The figure didn't move, didn't wave or gesture for help. It just stood there, staring. or at least she thought it was staring. Its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and its body was cloaked in a tattered coat that swayed in the faint breeze. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to drive past, but curiosity gnawed at her. She rolled down her window a crack. "Are you okay?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slowly, almost mechanically, and raised one long, thin hand to point down the road. Rachel's blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, I can't help you," she stammered, rolling the window up and pressing the gas pedal. Her car sped away, the figure vanishing into the darkness behind her. She couldn't shake the image of its unnatural stillness, the way it seemed to watch her even after she'd passed. Minutes later, she saw another figure. This one was crouched in the middle of the road, its back to her. Rachel slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a stop. The headlights illuminated the figure's hunched form. It looked human, but not quite. Its arms were too long, its fingers claw-like, dragging against the gravel. Rachel honked the horn, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Get out of the road!" she yelled, her voice echoing in the silence. The figure turned slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was a pale, featureless mask, the kind you'd see at a theater production, blank, expressionless, and haunting. It tilted its head, just like the first figure, before scuttling backward into the trees with an inhuman speed that made Rachel's heart nearly stop. Shaking, she pressed the gas pedal again, her only thought to reach the cabin as quickly as possible. The road twisted and turned, each shadow seeming to move each sound amplified in the suffocating quiet. Finally, she saw the cabin's porch light in the distance. Relief flooded her as she pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The air was still, and the cabin looked exactly as her cousin had described, quaint, rustic, and inviting. She grabbed her bag and rushed inside, locking the door behind her. The cabin was cozy, with a crackling fireplace and warm wooden walls. Rachel tried to shake the unease from her drive, telling herself it was just her imagination. She made herself a cup of tea and settled onto the couch, trying to calm her racing heart. Then she heard it, a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost tentative. She froze, her mug halfway to her lips. The knock came again, louder this time. She set the mug down and approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. A chill ran down her spine. She backed away from the door, her breathing shallow. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. She turned slowly, her eyes locking on the living room window. There, silhouetted against the glass, was the figure from the road. Its hat cast a shadow over its face, but she could see its long fingers tapping against the pane. Rachel stumbled backward, her legs trembling. "Go away!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, just like before. Slowly, it reached up and removed the hat. Its face, or lack of one, made her stomach lurch. There were no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, rasping sound. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. Rachel turned, her heart pounding. Standing in the doorway to the kitchen was another figure, identical to the one at the window. Its head tilted, its blank face eerily fixated on her. Behind it, more figures emerged, one by one, their twisted forms filling the room. The last thing Rachel saw was the hat lying abandoned on the floor as the cabin's light flickered and went out. By morning, the cabin was empty. Her car was still in the driveway, her belongings untouched. But no trace of Rachel was ever found, except for the hat now sitting neatly on the porch, waiting for the next visitor.